Hello, everybody. As we get closer to the American election, two odd things seem to be happening in contradiction, and perhaps explain why this election is increasingly surreal. On the one hand, the two candidates have profoundly different views of American history, sharply different, radically different. They think of American history in completely foreign terms. And on the other hand, of course, Americans are turning away from history. You can go online and always find a piece about the decline of the historical profession. There was one op-ed from the New York Times last year, lots of pieces about why students have turned away from history, and why in some ways many history courses in the United States are failing for one reason. So America is on the one hand obsessed with history, and on the other hand knows less and less about it. My guest today is a professional historian, Katherine Epstein, otherwise known as Kate, teaches at Rutgers University. And she has a fascinating piece in this issue of Liberties Quarterly on how, at least in her view, historians are killing history. We'll get to the piece in a few minutes, Kate, but I wonder, do you agree with that broader observation that on the one hand, Americans are in their own implicit way, their politics, their culture, obsessed with history, but on the other hand, they know less and less about it?
Yes, I do agree with that. I think that Americans, broadly speaking, are absolutely fascinated by the past, but what they think of as the past and as history is quite different from how professional scholars would think about the meaning of history and the past. But that's fine. It's actually a way to build on what Americans are already interested in. But I would generally agree, and I think you could hear this complaint from history professors and history teachers going back, I imagine, decades by this point, that their students come to college knowing less and less history. So
America, of course, was founded as a republic out of nothing, or at least a rebellion against British colonialism. So it doesn't have the kind of long history that China or Russia or the United Kingdom has, unless you want to include in the indigenous peoples. And yet, on the other hand, Americans seem obsessed with their origins, and there's this weird tension between a sort of a literal conservatism and a Republican liberalism. Does that also explain America's ambivalent attitude towards history? On the one hand, it's fetishized. On the other hand, it doesn't really exist.
Well, I've always thought of America as the world's teenager. It's kind of the perpetual teenager of the world, with all of the qualities that are both wonderful about adolescence and also deeply frustrating.
Do you have any teenagers, Kate, yourself?
Possibly. Yes,
so you're
I
speaking
do.
from experience. I
Speaking
do.
from
And,
experience.
I'm not sure if that's much of a compliment, but anyway, go on.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. But so no, I do think that there's this way in which, and I'm just sort of speaking off the cuff here, but I do think there's a way in which kind of not having as long a weight of the past in American history has almost probably led to a certain almost status anxiety. I mean, it's a classic insight by historians of nationalism, is that nations are very interested in sort of being able to trace their lineage back to antiquity in some way. I think probably more broadly, just a general human urge to be able to have a sense of rootedness in something.
I'm always astonished with the amount of interest that Americans have in the founding fathers, in Jefferson and Washington and obviously Hamilton. I mean, have musicals about him these days, which other countries, where I'm from, the UK, for example, no one ever took British history particularly seriously. Although maybe that's the generals. I know you studied at Cambridge, so maybe you have a different experience.
No, well, one of the actually the really, to me, quite odd things about the way Americans express their interest in the past is, as you say, there's almost an obsession with origins. And it's like there's got to be like, a single point in time. And that's, I think, part of the reason, the 1619 project sort of generated the heat that it did is that Americans just, it's almost like a mental habit to invest a particular year, a particular founding story with enormous interpretive weight. And I don't think other nations do that. Like Britain doesn't have like 1066 or 1215 or 1815. It doesn't attach the same weight to a single year or a single generation or a single event the way that Americans do to the founding.
Let me extend then your metaphor. You described America as the world's teenager. Maybe we might just add on to that the world's adopted teenager. Adopted children, particularly teenagers, have a particular obsession with their origins, which can, of course, never be traced. So it creates a desire which can never quite be fulfilled.
Yes, I mean, to me, this is part of what maturity would mean at either an individual or collective level. It has to do with, I mean, it's correct. There's the search for origins is almost a search for some sort of fixity, for being able to say, this is exactly who we are. And the problem is that it's constantly in flux. The United States has all sorts of, I've actually written about this in my most recent book, but the United States, like other nations, is sort of deeply invested in a sense of itself as exceptional. I need to update that website, but I don't think it has my new book. But the US is deeply invested in a sense of itself as an exceptional nation, which is in some ways the least exceptional thing about the United States. Like other nations care deeply about seeing themselves as exceptional too. But I suspect, certainly couldn't prove it, but yes, that there's something about the kind of relative youth of the United States that simultaneously gives it this kind of I don't know, chest thumping. We're confident, we're powerful. We know what to do in the way that teenagers. Human and taught like H3 is another classic moment to go through this, where you feel so full of power, and then you're constantly running up against limits to what you can do. You still need your parents to drive you to the mall, for instance. Even though you think you figured out how to solve the world's problems.
And then more than just chest thumping, it's not just the conservatives who fetishize the Washingtons and Jeffersons and Hamiltons in American history, but the alternative narrative on the left amongst progressives is the MLK version, the Whiggish narrative of history being a narrative of moral improvement. So the two versions aren't dramatically different, are they?
No, I think that I'm not the only historian who would object to the famous line, although I love Letter from a Birmingham Jail, who would object to the line that the arc of history bends towards justice. I don't.
Is that a teenage remark, Kate?
Is that a teenage remark? I don't think so. But I also think, I've just been rereading Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society. And Niebuhr was an influence on King. Niebuhr argues that you kind of have to have faith that the world is improving and that the arc does bend towards justice in order to actually act in the world in the face of doubt and despair. And I also think that's, part of what's so lovely about teenagers and young people more generally is that they haven't reconciled themselves to living with everything that's wrong about the world, and
One
unjust.
thing we can say about Niebuhr is he wasn't a teenager.
No, he was not. No, he was not. And I mean, King was remarkably young, stunningly young, as were and the activists in SNCC were even younger. But I don't think it's an accident that
Mm.
the people who were driving the direct action sit-ins were in their late teens and 20s. I mean, the same age as my students.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this into a conversation about MLK, but on the one hand, he had a fairly simplistic historical narrative. On the other hand, he and his life were very complicated. But let's get to your Peace and Liberties. It's called Historians Killing History, although it has another name as well. What historians are doing to history. And in any event, it's not very good news about historians. I want to get to the core of the piece in a second, but do you think countries get the historians they deserve? In other words, does America have historians that somehow reflect America, as France or Britain or Russia has similar different historians reflecting their own particular realities?
Yes, is the short answer. The longer version of the answer is that I think, and I tried to say this in the piece, the kind of causal relationship between any institution and the larger society that it's a part of is going to go in both directions, and the causal chains are going to interact in all sorts of ways. But it does seem to me that I think of the line from British soldiers in World War I, that it was a case of lions led by donkeys.
Mm.
And I often think to myself, well, I think we may have a case of donkeys being led by donkeys, just in the sense that what I tried to argue in the piece is that the historians, the historical profession, which in my view has a sort of special responsibility and a special role in society to uphold scholarly standards, which should privilege rigor and complexity and process over outcome, that too many historians are actually mimicking the behavior that I so intensely dislike in American culture more broadly, certainly in our political discourse, but not confined to political discourse, of just shooting from the hip, not thinking before you speak, not trying to come to grips with complexity
I've
in an
never seen
honest
that,
way.
Kate.
No, I'm sure you haven't. So I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, the title of which was "Academic Twitter Puts the Moron in Oxymoron." And so I think of it as just the set of values and habits that Twitter and social media more broadly are kind of the expression of. That is, I think the historical profession has made far too many compromises in that
Right, and
direction.
I think your piece was, well, you were certainly written about it. Is Twitter making academia
Yes.
stupid and mean? It's obviously a little dated now because it's the company formerly known as Twitter.
Known as Twitter,
Has another
indeed.
name.
Indeed.
So you talk about donkeys being led by donkeys. Some people might be watching this and thinking, well, here's a rather absurd donkey calling the rest of her profession donkeys. What distinguishes you? Why are you, and maybe a teenager might put it, why do you have the right to criticize the rest of your profession? What makes you so special?
What makes me so special,
Kate
Sunshine?
Epstein.
Yes. I don't think I have any special right, but I also don't think I have any special obstacle. I think I have as much or as little right as any other member of the profession. As I say in the piece, I fully recognize that my argument could be dismissed as sort of anecdata or impressionistic. And in a certain sense, true enough. You can't, I mean, the historical profession is
Yeah, and it's
huge.
not I mean, let's be clear, you're not writing in a professional journal. You're
I was
writing in
not,
Liberties,
no.
which is a quarterly of popular opinion. It's high end, but there's no reason why you should be writing as an academic historian in the piece. But my question is, and going back to it, what makes you able to see what's gone wrong in your profession?
I think that I have a somewhat unusual perspective, in that I actually am by training a military historian. I write about kind of the hardest of hardcore military history. I look at my specialty is naval weapon systems and their relationship to government secrecy and intellectual property rights. I wrote a book about torpedoes. I have a new book out on naval gun retargeting systems, which were analog computers. And that's not common in civilian academia. Most people who are interested in the types of things that I'm interested in are employed in PME, professional military education. So the service academies, the war colleges, and so forth. I actually turned down a job at one of the Naval Postgraduate School, not a war college, but the Naval Postgraduate School. And it's been well documented, I think, and very vigorously argued by military historians that there's a sort of spurious prejudice against military history.
Okay, so you're on the one hand, you research something which for most of us is certainly rather academic, to put it politely, military history, the history of torpedoes. And then on the other hand, I think, and I'm going to put some words into your mouth, and I know you note this in the piece, you also have an interest in theory. You're well versed in Foucault and a lot of the critical ideas which have shaped, for better or worse, professional historicism in the American university.
Yes, and I'm sorry if I was going on too long, but that's at the heart of what I think is kind of unusual. Usually, I don't think a lot of military historians are, generally speaking, this is a generalization, that interested in understanding, say, the history of gender or the history of race. These are kind of constructed as almost binary opposites. I'm very interested in both. It's very important to me to be able to talk with people intelligently or reasonably intelligently, who are interested in those things. And so this kind of binary between quote unquote traditional history and quote unquote untraditional history, which I think has become politicized, and there are political valences attached to those. I don't like it, because I feel that I've learned from both kinds of approaches. And so what I was trying to do in that piece find a way to uh, to subvert that binary in a way that doesn't subvert the notion of scholarly standards altogether, which I think are vital.
So before we get to historians killing history, they're not really killing history, of course. They're killing academic history, or they're killing the telling of history or the profession of history. They're not actually killing history. What got you in the field? Why, leaving aside studying torpedoes, why have you dedicated your life to the study of history? What is it about history that makes it so attractive?
I've always been fascinated by it since I was a kid. Always actually had a fascination with war in particular. Don't know where it comes from. Don't come from a military family. My father read a lot of history and read in part military history, but not only military history. I loved history classes, but I also loved English classes and Latin classes and math and science classes. I've always loved ideas and learning new
Have you
things.
got one or two historians who really inspired you when you were growing up as an undergraduate, books that you read that you thought, wow, this is incredible, I want to do this?
It was actually, so a couple as an undergrad, and then even more, I would say, in grad school. So I remember being incredibly impressed by James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom in the
Mm.
Oxford history of the US. I remain deeply impressed by that book. Um, I read a few things. I took the famous / infamous grand strategy class at Yale with John Gaddis and Paul Kennedy and Charlie Hill,
Mm.
and read Jeffrey Parker's book, The Grand Strategy of Philip II. Jeffrey became my doctoral supervisor. I thought that was so impressive. And then when I was in grad school, starting to work on my dissertation, the two historians who had the biggest influence on me and just had very, very high standards, very demanding standards for kind of what counts as adequate research, were John Sumida and Nicholas Lambert, who
So there
both,
are, so in other words,
yeah,
there are historians who, in your view, are models for how to do history.
absolutely. And part of the
So,
reason I wrote that piece was just because I also, it's not like I think I'm unique in caring about these things. I
right.
think that
Although
actually,
again, it's the kind of thing we've been reading about for every generation seems to have some some crisis book or piece about how
yeah.
we're not learning about the past. But let's get to your argument. Historians killing history. What's gone wrong, Kate, with the American business of doing history?
So for me, at the heart of it is inadequate primary source research. And especially archival research, which is the kind of research that I'm most familiar with because it's the kind of research that I do. Although I've heard kind of versions of this argument from people who work with primary sources that are not archival in nature. And I, my impression reading things as a peer reviewer, reading books that win prizes, is that what I would consider to be kind of an adequate evidentiary base for the argument that an author wants to make is much higher than, or broader than, what they consider to be an adequate evidentiary base. I find, again, speaking generally, a lack of precision in relating argument to evidence. And so I would call it craft. I don't think that graduate schools are training graduate students to do archival research
So is the
in a
problem in
rigorous
this,
way.
what you call this crisis of craft, is the problem that graduate students or historians are not going into libraries to research the primary material, or they going with the wrong attitude, with a misunderstanding of what the art or craft of history actually is?
I think it's both. I think that historians rely too much on getting scans of material from archives without having visited the physical repository itself. And I think that that's a poor substitute for visiting the physical repository, in the same way that online teaching is a poor substitute for in-person teaching. You lose so much relevant information. And I also think that historians are going to archives, but they're spending 2 days there when they need to spend 2 months there, for to really understand how the archive was constructed, go through the iterative process of research, which is I go in with one question, start looking at sources, I realize that wasn't the right question, I formulate a new one. So it's a combination of both, I think.
And then you seem to be saying in the piece, Historians Killing History, that many quote unquote historians already know what they want to say before they study the history. They've got the
Yes.
narratives in their mind, the conservative narrative, the progressive narrative, where it's the nostalgia for the past with the conservatives, or the MLK style progressive narrative. So they go in looking for the appropriate facts to back up an argument which already existed before they showed up in the library. Is that fair?
Yes, that is what I was saying. What I want to, I do want to add one caveat to that, which I tried to be careful about inserting, which is that I don't think having an argument or having a bias, to use the most loaded term, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's unavoidable for human beings to have biases, to have hunches, hypotheses, perspectives, identities that they bring to what they're studying. And I think it's naive and incorrect to think of human beings as blank slates. Um, I actually think that having a different perspective, having a particular bias can actually sharpen your analysis of the evidence just as surely as it can blunt it. But I also think that to stand the test of time and to command the assent of people who don't share your perspective, your bias, whatever, that you have to produce work that meets traditional scholarly standards, which are about originality, importance, and the relationship of argument to evidence.
Last year, you had another interesting piece in Liberties, Scholarship and the Future of Society, which in some ways is not disconnected or unconnected with this current piece. Why does this all matter, Kate, for the future of society? Why should we care? So maybe historians aren't quite as good as they used to be or should be, but that's probably true of most professions, from medicine to dentistry to engineering to novel writing. Why should we care about what you see as this crisis of the historical profession?
Because to me, the study of the past is at the heart of a humanities education. And a humanities education is at the heart of liberal democratic citizenship. To me, it's the study of the past that more than any other academic discipline teaches people how to empathize with real human beings, not literary characters. And I think actually literature is also wonderful for building this kind of empathic capacity. But what distinguishes history is that you are dealing with real people who had the same dignity or lack thereof as we do today. And the process of trying to understand why the world that they inhabited made sense to them the way they made sense of it is exactly the same muscle that we need to understand our fellow citizens. Robin Collingwood, who is a philosopher of history, has this great line in a book called The Idea of History, where he says, this is a very close paraphrase, I think I've got it a little wrong. He says that if it is by historical thinking that we understand the thoughts of a Hammurabi or a Solon, so it is by historical thinking that we understand the thoughts of the friend who writes us a letter or the stranger who crosses a street. It's all the same muscle. And Collingwood made a rather imperialistic claim for history being kind of the queen discipline for learning to basically temporarily discipline yourself, your own sense of identity, according to historical evidence, to try to look at the world through someone else's eyes. And to me, the relationship between process and substance in that, between the process of gathering evidence and trying to understand it as rigorously as possible, is inseparable from a respect for human dignity, which is at the core of both the humanities disciplines and I think at the core of liberal democracy. And so I think of I think there's a very close analogy, and I think I said this at the start of Historians Killing History. I think there's a very close analogy between the relationship between due process and liberal democracy on the one hand, and between scholarly process and humanism in the academy on the other hand.
Yeah, a whole generation, including myself, of English school kids who specially studied history. We all grew up with that Collingwood book. So, of course, we live in a time where many people, particularly progressives, believe that there is a crisis of democracy. Do you see a direct connection between the two things?
I don't know about direct, but I don't know how they couldn't be related. I mean, I I think I got pushback on the first essay I wrote in Liberties, the Scholarship and the Future of Society piece, which is classic pushback to any historian's argument. Are you just mistaking correlation for causation? And could be, but it's really hard for me to believe that if historians, who of all people should be in favor of slowing down and trying to understand the world through other people's eyes and preaching the value of that to any decent society, are going on Twitter and adapting
Yeah,
them.
it's called X now.
Sorry, X, apologies.
I'm teasing you.
Are going on and adapting. I mean, I think social media is fundamentally anti-humanistic. And I don't mean that I don't mean that in any sort of left versus right sense. I mean, it's way deeper than that. It is anti-humane and anti-humanistic. Um, it's like, to me, it just feels sometimes like historians have decided, well, if we can't beat them, join them. And I think I mean, to put it very bluntly, and I'm an idealist, but seems to me like a
You
betrayal
can
of
be a good
fiduciary.
historian though and be on X. I mean, people like Simon Sharma, who are, I don't know what you think of his work, but he's one of the world's most
Sure.
famous historians, prolific in his books about all sorts of things, and he's also prolific on X. So I mean, can't you be a historian and just be as an annoying person on X as anyone else?
Yeah, sure. And people are entitled to their private lives. I've a few concerns about how historians use Twitter. One is, and I would absolutely agree, there are more and less responsible ways of using Twitter. But I do think fundamentally, like, it, historians adapt themselves to Twitter. They do not bend Twitter to their ends. X, sorry, I keep calling it Twitter. X bends historians to its ends. If you're going on X, you're already playing kind of by enemy terms. um, and so I do think there's already a concession there. I do think that there are historians with kind of the self-discipline and the maturity to use X responsibly.
Right, and of
But
course, X is owned by the world's wealthiest teenager,
indeed,
and
indeed.
so that reflects him and everyone else. Kate, some people might be listening and probably agreeing. It's hard to disagree with quite a lot of what you're saying, but they might say, well, the kids aren't reading. I know you have issues with the way in which they're using OpenAI and ChatGPT. Um, every day, it seems, in the New York Times, there's another piece about why kids, both school kids and undergraduates, are not reading books. So however good historians are, the kids in the classroom are going to be on X or on Facebook or on Instagram, and are just going to be bored by all this. So ultimately, so what? Why can historians? They're Canute. They can't change the nature of things, can they?
So I, first of all, think they can to some degree. The classic Marx quote, Karl, not Groucho, men make history, but they do not make it just as they please. Structure does not dominate everything. People do retain agency. And I think that's a threadbare rationalization for kind of quietism and resignation, to say, oh, well, I don't have any power. What's the point? I mean, if that's the attitude, then we might as well all just pack up our toys and go home. But I also think that, and I've actually been wanting to write something else about it, but I think that it is a fundamental misreading of America's young people to believe that they do not crave better than what is being offered them. I think that's part of the reason they feel so unmoored. I do think the human soul. This is sorry, and this is not a historical position. This is just me speaking as a person. I do think there's something about the human soul craves thought and can tell the difference between, I don't know, a soundbite and someone who's actually asking you to wrestle with complexity. And I think too many American kids, and they're complicit in this to some degree themselves, but too many of their teachers are having them do group projects, justifying it on the logic that they need to learn how to work together for future their future workplace. No, they do not need to learn that in middle school. They need to learn how to read and write and do math. They need to learn how to develop their individual intellectual powers. And if you think that kids are too stupid to understand their own interests, even if it's subconscious, even if they can't put into words that they are craving something different from what they're being offered, I think you misunderestimate that malapropism. I think you misunderstand young people. I do not think that. I don't think that is fundamental young person nature.
So there
And
sounds
it's a
to me,
betrayal of
Kate,
them.
in your analysis and critique, there's more Alan Bloom here than Michel Foucault.
I actually, it has been so long since I read Alan Bloom that I couldn't even tell you whether I'm disagreeing with him or not.
Well, you should
Or
reread. I'd be interested
I
to see
should
what you think
reread.
of it.
I should reread. You're absolutely right. But Foucault, like if you read Foucault, I mean, I think Foucault, even if you end up disagreeing with him, the man had a powerful intellect. Like
Yeah,
one
although I
ought.
wouldn't call Foucault historian. I mean, you're an academic, you're a professional historian. I'm not sure I would call Foucault a historian. When I think of him,
Philosopher
historian
more.
is not the first word that comes to mind. I mean, of course, he was in some senses a historian.
But what I was just trying to say is, you were saying I sounded more like Bloom than Foucault, but Foucault expected people to work analytically. Like this was like doing what Foucault is trying to tell us to do is very, very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
So he would have been, I mean, if you think he's, throwing softballs to college students, I mean, I assign him.
Well, although one wonders, given his politics, whether he ever came across stuff in the stacks that disturbed him, and maybe he would just ignore them rather than turning it into a particular kind of narrative. I mean, all his narratives pursue a similar, I don't know if the right word is ideology, certainly sensibility.
That seems correct to me, but I also know that there's since basically the whole argument of my essay in Liberties is expertise is a real thing, and by nature it has limits. I'm not expert in the large literature on the thought of Michel Foucault, so I would not like to pretend to have an informed opinion.
Right, and you certainly know infinite more about it than I do. Finally, do you think, I mean, you're a professional historian, which means you stand in front of large classes of kids at Rutgers and you teach them history. Do you think ultimately that the kids these days, and this really reiterates what you were saying earlier, they see through these arguments? They know exactly what these so-called historians are doing when they present convenient narratives that suit their own ideological agendas, and that is the ultimate turnoff.
I don't know if they can do that. What I think they can do is sense when they're being condescended to by someone who has very low expectations for them intellectually and who is not giving them the respect of trying to hold them to higher expectations that they are in fact capable of meeting. So I don't think, my sense is that they don't process it as, oh, this narrative is too ideologically pat. And because many of them have not had the benefit of a rigorous history education from in middle school and high school, I think it would probably be hard for them to recognize that. I could be wrong, but I do think that they, on some level, can recognize when they are not being asked to work versus when they are being asked to work intellectually and psychologically, because this stuff is actually really it's not just intellectually demanding to study history really carefully. It is in some ways emotionally and psychologically demanding
to
as
me,
well.
as a parent, the one with my kids going to fancy private schools, the real tragedy is that these kids, there is no history in high school. They don't even pretend to teach history.
That's really sad to hear.
Yeah, I mean, every 14-year-old should be forced to spend 6 months trying to figure out the causes of the First World War. That would
I had
make
an
them...
amazing, I had amazing teachers all through middle school and high school, but I remember one, Mr. King. I mean, we were reading Darkness at Noon. We were reading Kafka in 11th grade history. It was an incredible year.
But that's not going back. I mean, this is my final question, Kate. It's an interesting subject. It's all very well reading Darkness at Noon as a way of trying to understand Stalin's Soviet Union. But what you're suggesting in the piece is that maybe not the students, but certainly the historians can't rely on Darkness at Noon. They've got to go back to the stack. So the question becomes, how you do all this and keep history alive and interesting and relevant and, if not sexy, certainly sufficiently attractive to get people's attention, because we are in, or you guys are in, the attention game. And if you're purists, technically, in terms of your craft, and you turn everyone off, then ultimately it's pointless, isn't it?
Sure. If you turn everyone off, I agree it is. Yes, you have to be able to actually command the attention and the interest of, 18, 19-year-olds. And you have to get some sort of level of buy-in there. I think too many historians have responded to that with various techniques. One is, the spread of role-playing games, the gamification of history education.
Oh,
I think,
my God, dreadful.
Allowing students to submit, podcasts or video essays for assignments in lieu of a 4 to 6 page keyhole essay, which I will maintain until my dying day is intellectually more demanding than other formats. And I don't think that that's an intellectually defensible way to go about holding students' attention. At least it's not defensible to do that and pretend that you aren't lowering standards. At least be honest about it.
So you never, in any of your classes, you never get your students to dress up as torpedoes?
I do not get them to dress up as torpedoes. I used to do an exercise where they had to put on a banker's hat, a top hat, and I got one other hat meant to symbolize the flow of money through the American banking system in the late 19th century. But that was as far as I went.
Well, I better not make any more torpedo jokes, so I get myself into trouble.
That's okay.
Katherine Epstein, author of Historians Killing History, important subject. You bring some great wisdom and rigor to the subject, and I'm sure you will publish much more on the subject, particularly in Liberties. So we'll get you back on the show in the not too distant future. Thanks so much, Kate. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for having me.